Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. 2024 has been full of many surprise releases, with many new brands forging their path in the peripheral market with amazing first release products. Many of these brands I'd classify as a sleeper brand, as many of them just came out of nowhere. Now, I've covered a couple of these sleeper releases here on the channel already this year, one of them being the Sprime PM1, and today we're going to be talking about another sleeper release, the Santali Aagaz S1-O Mirage. The Santali S1-O caught my eye for a variety of reasons, mainly its unique shape, the coloring, the interesting design, and the extremely good on-paper specs. But another aspect of this mouse that caught my eye was the design of the USB-C port. We've only seen two other mice this year have the same designed USB-C port, and that was the Ninjutsu Sora V2 and the Sprime PM1, two of my favorite releases this year. And as it turns out, the S1-O shares a lot more than just the same USB port design with the Sora V2 and the PM1, and while they do share a lot of similarities, the S1-O does outclass those mice in a lot of areas, specifically in terms of performance and polling rates. So in today's episode of the mel0n Review, we're going to take a deep dive and talk all about the good and not so good of Santali's first mouse, and much more about the mouse's similarities to the Sora V2 and the Sprime PM1. But before we dive in, I want to say a big thank you to Santali for sending over the Aagaz S1-O Mirage for review. As a reminder, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. And if you enjoyed the review of the Santali Aagaz S1-O and want to see more reviews like this, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. I will also have a full teardown of the S1-O coming out in a couple days as well, so if you'd like to see how this mouse is built on the inside and how to service it and repair it yourself, be sure to get subscribed. Alright, well without further ado, let's go right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. Starting off, let's talk about in-game performance. To my surprise, the S1-O is a very well executed mouse with fantastic performance across the board. The shape is a rather interesting take on a symmetrical shape, being a flatter, wider design, but to my surprise it was actually very comfortable. I did need to tweak the shape slightly to make it compatible with my larger hands, which I'll explain more about this later in this video, but the S1-O shape was surprisingly good and quite comfy when I got accustomed to it. The mouse also has a fantastic coating that performed extremely well over my testing. The mouse's clicks are also very well implemented and designed, specifically the main clicks, as they're using an Omron switch, so they're very snappy with a great tactile feed to them. The S1-O also has 8K polling on both wired and wireless connectivity types, and the high polling rates are very well implemented, and across the board the S1-O performs extremely well. I did have some major issues with the wired usage, but not because of the polling or implementation, more about the USB-C port design, but I'll talk more about that later in this video. I also wanted to mention I love the coloring of the S1-O Mirage Edition. It looks fantastic, and the contrast between the blue and the orange looks great with any setup. Once I got accustomed to the S1-O's more unique shape, the mouse honestly blew me away with how well it performed. The wider and shorter symmetrical shape made the mouse good for every aim type, so static, tracking, and flicking aiming all was consistent and natural on the S1-O, and within a few hours on the mouse I was beaming people in Overwatch 2 and Splitgate without any problems. But despite the fantastic overall feel and performance of the S1-O, the mouse sadly isn't perfect. There are some minor issues with the design of the mouse, and as I mentioned earlier, the wired usage is less than ideal, but for the most part the S1-O is a very solid mouse. For this being Santali's first mouse, I'm incredibly impressed, as this feels like a mouse I'd see from a flagship brand, not a brand new name in the peripheral space. Next up, let's talk unboxing. Now, the unboxing experience here for the S1-O is a very no-frills approach, but a good experience nonetheless. The S1-O Mirage Edition I have here comes in this Mirage-themed packaging. The S1-O's black and white colors will come in similar packaging, just without the Mirage theming. Inside the packaging, we have the S1-O itself. We also have a USB A to C cable, a pre-cut set of white grip tape, an extra set of full-size stock skates, and a USB-C 8K polling dongle. The dongle does have rubber on the base of it, so it does anchor itself to desktops very well, and lastly we have a little welcome card. Sadly, there is no paper user manual included, but the other side of the welcome card does tell you where to go to download the user manual and the driver for the S1-O itself. Ideally, I would like to see a paper manual included, or at least a QR code that links directly to the user manual on the welcome card, but at least the manual and the driver are easy to find on Santali's website, so this isn't a major issue. Overall, the unboxing experience is pretty good here for the S1-O. A few things could improve, but overall it's a good unboxing experience. Now, when it comes to build quality and QC, with all newer brands this is often a common stumbling point for them, but here with the S1-O the overall quality is fantastic, and it turns out there's a very unique reason as to why. Out of the box, the S1-O feels fantastic in the hand, the build quality is exceptional, and my unit didn't develop any creaking or flexing issues over my testing. The S1-O's QC is also surprisingly solid. All the clicks feel consistent, and there is no noticeable issues with the unit at all, which is very impressive for such a new brand. So how did Santali Santali pull this off? Well, a good hint as to why, as I mentioned at the top of the video, is that the S1-O has the exact same USB-C port design as the Sora V2 and the Sprime PM1. It also does share some other similarities in terms of how the S1-O is built and designed. This is because the S1-O is manufactured in the same factory that the Sora V2 and Sprime PM1 were manufactured in, and the S1-O is also made out of the same fiber composite or polycarbonate material we saw the Sora V2 and Sprime PM1 shells made out of. In addition to being made in the same factory and out of the same material, the overall design of the S1-O has vastly improved over the Sora V2 and the PM1. The S1-O shell is significantly firmer and much more rigid than the shells we saw on the prior mice, and the internal design is also significantly improved as there is no longer that weird clip towards the rear of the mouse, and that clip made disassembling the Sora V2 and PM1 extremely difficult, and I'm very happy not to see that here on the S1-O. In my opinion, the build quality and QC we find here on the S1-O feels like what we would have seen on a Sora V3 or a PM1 V2, and while we'll never probably see a follow-up to those mice hit the market, at least we have a spiritual successor to those mice here in the form of the S1-O. But overall, the build quality and QC here on the S1-O is fantastic, easily one of the best built polycarbonate mice we've seen this year, but the design of the S1-O does carry over some design flaws from the Sora V2 and the PM1, as well as introduce a new one, so let's talk about those design flaws next. The first of these design flaws is the aforementioned USB-C port, as it is sadly non-universal, so you can only use the S1-O's cable with the mouse. This is particularly frustrating as the mouse's stock cable is very bad, so much so that you can't effectively use it for gaming, so not being able to use a better USB-C cable with the S1-O is very frustrating. Just like I said when I reviewed the Sora V2 and the PM1, there's no reason to make a universal USB-C port only work with one specific cable. It's just pointless in my opinion, and it causes unnecessary frustration for the customer. I'd strongly suggest that Santali make the USB-C port on their future mice be full universal size, as we see on most if not all the flagship gaming mice on the market. The second flaw with the S1-O's design is the bottom dongle storage compartment. Now this may seem a little odd, as in my unboxing part of this video I didn't mention the USB-A dongle at all, and that's because the mouse doesn't come with a USB-A dongle, but it still has the USB-A dongle storage compartment in the base of the mouse. So why is there a dongle storage compartment here on the S1-O in the first place? Well, according to Santali, the mouse was initially supposed to come with a USB-A dongle, but it was scrapped in favor of including the AK pulling dongle instead. Unfortunately, by the time this decision was made, the base for the S1-O had already been finalized and manufactured, so Santali was put in a weird position as they either had to scrap the USB-A dongle or remake all of their bases. Now, we've seen many mice come with both a USB-A dongle and a high pulling rate dongle, but Santali decided not to include the USB-A dongle as it increased the cost of the mouse as well as create unnecessary e-waste, as the dongle would be largely useless. Now, this may come as a shock to some of you, but I actually agree with Santali's decision here. Due to them being a smaller brand, they didn't have the funds to remake all the bases, and doing so would just create more e-waste, which they're trying not to create. So not including the USB-A dongle and shipping the unit with the dongle storage compartment base was their best course of action. Now, to be clear, I am disappointed to see the dongle storage on a high performance mouse, absolutely, but at least Santali was open and honest and explained why the mouse shipped like this in the first place, which I really appreciate. Santali also said that their future mice will not be including this dongle storage, as they'll only ship with the AK dongle, so this issue will be resolved on their future mice, which is great to see. But overall, given the unique situation that Santali was put in here when designing the S1-O, I do think they made the right decision, and I'm happy to see a brand be so conscientious of e-waste. I wish more brands were like this actually. But while I'm going to give Santali a pass for this USB-A dongle storage, there is absolutely no excuse for this custom sized USB-C port. There is no reason for it to be custom sized. It's a universal connector, and making it non-universal just doesn't make any sense. And as I mentioned earlier, this custom sized USB-C port heavily hampered the wire usage here in the S1-O, so let's talk a little bit more about that next. Now, as just mentioned earlier, because of the custom sized USB-C port here on the S1-O, you can only use the stock cable that comes with the S1-O for wired usage on this mouse. Now, ironically enough, since the Sprime PM1 and Sora V2 have the exact same custom sized USB-C port, you can use their stock cables with the S1-O, and they do ever so slightly improve the wired usage, but overall the experience is still less than ideal, and you can't really take full advantage of the S1-O's AK wired pulling because of this custom sized port. Now, in regards to the S1-O's stock cable, it's a very thick paracord wrap cable. The paracord wrapping is smooth, but the cable is extremely thick, and because of this, the cable is very rigid and doesn't have a lot of flexibility to it, so the cable feels very heavy and clunky when used. The extreme thickness also prevents the stock cable from being compatible with bungees, as it's too thick and rigid to be used. On top of all that, the S1-O stock cable also doesn't have a tilted USB USB-C end, so the stock cable, due to its weight, drags against your mousepad surfaces and causes a lot of unnecessary friction that even further hampers the wired experience. All of this leads to a very subpar wired experience here with the S1-O stock cable. The experience is slightly better with the stock cables from the Sora V2 and the PM1, as I mentioned earlier, as they're a little less rigid, but the experience is still less than ideal even with those cables. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here, as I've said this so many times, but if you're going to ship a mouse with 4 or 8K wired polling, you have to include a usable stock cable. If the S1-O only supported 1K polling and the cable was only used for charging, I'd be less frustrated, but not being able to fully utilize the S1-O's 8K wired polling was very disappointing, not only due to the poor stock cable, but also the mouse's incompatibility with universal USB-C cables. So in addition to changing the mouse's USB-C port to be a universal size, I would love to see Santali include a cable similar to the Pulsar stock cables we saw in the X2 V2 and X2H, as those cables are thinner, more flexible, compatible with mouse bungees, and have a tilted USB-C end. A cable like that included with future Santali mouse would be perfect, but sadly in its current state, wire usage is very poor here on the S1-O. I would recommend sticking with wireless use on this mouse, as wired use is very bad. Alright, now in terms of weight, Santali is advertising that the S1-O is going to be weighing in around 49 grams with a plus-minus gram ratio of 2 grams. Weighing in my unit with the stock skates installed and the USB-A cover installed on the base dongle storage, my unit is weighing in around 49.25 grams. Which, while it's not under the advertised weight spec, is only 0.25 grams heavier, which is still well within the plus-minus 2 gram spec. Of course, the S1-O's weight would be lower if the internal USB-C storage compartment was removed, but the current weight is still quite good. I would love to see a future version of the S1-O weigh more around the 40 to 45 gram range. As with the polycarbonate shell, there are lots of ways to reduce the weight, but the current S1-O's weight is still decent in my opinion. Now, in regards to balancing, this is one area where the S1-O is a little odd. Picking up the unit at the midline of the mouse, you'll notice that the mouse actually tilts forward. This is because due to the dongle storage compartment in the base of the mouse, Santali was forced to install the battery slightly forward in the shell to where they originally intended to put it, which is causing the mouse to be slightly forward heavy. So instead of being centrally balanced as intended, the S1-O is balanced about 3 centimeters up in the shell from the midline of the mouse. I actually didn't even notice the higher balancing point during my testing. I only noticed it when I went to balance the unit in preparation for this review. So while the S1-O isn't perfectly balanced as it should be, it likely won't affect the performance of the mouse at all, as it still does feel pretty well balanced. Now, since Santali confirmed that their future mice will not have this dongle storage compartment in the base shell, all future versions of Santali's mouse will be centrally balanced, as there's not going to be any kind of dongle storage interfering with the installation point of the batteries. Alright, let's talk about the S1-O's shape next. In terms of dimensions, the S1-O is 125mm long, 65mm wide, and 39mm tall. The shell shape, as I mentioned earlier, is symmetrical, but it's a wider and flatter design as opposed to the thinner, taller symmetrical shapes we commonly see. Now, you can use the S1-O as an ambidextrous mouse, but left-handed users won't have access to side buttons. Looking at the S1-O from the top, we can see this wider symmetrical shape with its slight hourglass indentation towards the midline of the mouse. Flipping the mouse over and looking from the bottom, we can better see the slight hourglass-like shape of the S1-O shell, and we can also see that the base of the mouse is much smaller than the wider upper shell. Looking at the mouse from the side, we can get a better look at the S1-O's centrally optimized hump profile, which terminates roughly at the midpoint of the mouse, and that the curvature of the shell is much more aggressive towards the front of the mouse than the rear. Looking at the mouse from the front, we can get a much better look at the wider upper shell, and we can also see the sides of the S1-O are quite outwardly tilted and curved on the sides. And lastly, looking from the back, we can get an even better view of the rear hump's curvature, which is a widened, flattened, slightly rounded hump design. Overall, the S1-O shape is very unique. It's probably the widest and flattest symmetrical mouse I've personally tested, and this unique shell shape has some interesting effects on grip and hand size compatibility, so let's talk about that next. For my 1905 by 12.7 centimeter hands, I'm able to semi-comfortably use a claw grip here on the S1-O. As I mentioned earlier, I did need to alter the shape of the mouse by using the Soul Spacer shapeshift grips to make some anchoring points on the left and right sides of the S1-O shell, but this is just because my hands are so large and wide, my fingers weren't making proper contact with the sides of the mouse, so I had to use the shapeshift grips, but this did make the S1-O extremely comfortable for my hand size, something that doesn't commonly happen with symmetrical mice. In terms of contact areas, due to the wider rear hump, my hand's primary contact point is the upper mid palm and my mid to low thenar and hypothenar. Normally on most mice, my primary contact points are my thenar and hypothenar, but due to the wider lower hump design of the S1-O, there's much more emphasis on mid palm contact than you'd see on other symmetrical mice. As I mentioned earlier, the S1-O is a very comfortable shape for my larger hands, of course with the sole spacer shapeshift grips, which isn't something I commonly say about many symmetrical mice. If you have very large hands like myself, you might need to use something like the sole spacers to make some anchoring points on the sides, but for most hand sizes, the S1-O shell will be compatible with most grip styles and hand sizes. Now, in terms of hand and grip compatibility, for small hands, palm grip is going to be the go-to grip for the S1-O. For small to medium hands, palm grip again. For medium hands, palm or claw grips will be compatible. For medium to large hands, you can do palm, claw, and fingertip grips. And for large-handed folk, you'll be best off using a claw or a fingertip grip. Now, technically speaking, while fingertip grip is usable here on the S1-O, it's not the best as the shell is a little wider, so it can be a little awkward to grip, and the weight isn't very fingertip grip friendly. So while you can fingertip grip the S1-O, I'd recommend sticking with claw or palm grips instead. Now, in terms of coating, as I mentioned earlier, the S1-O has a fantastic coating, and since the mouse is made in the same factory as the PM1 and the Sora V2, unsurprisingly, the coating here on the S1-O is quite similar to those mice. The coating is a rather chalky coating, just like the PM1 and Sora V2's coating, but the S1-O's coating is ever so slightly rougher and a little bit more chalky, and ever so slightly grippier than the coatings on the PM1 and Sora V2. For both wet and dry hands, the coating performs extremely well, but the coating is best suited for sweatier hands as the coating is the grippiest when it's exposed to a little bit of moisture. As someone with very sweaty hands, I was able to use the S1-O without any kind of grip aid, aside from the shape chips of course, as the coating was very grippy and I was able to anchor my hands to the mouse without any issues during testing. I also wanted to note that even though my palms get very sweaty, during my testing I never felt the need to re-anchor my palm as the coating was so grippy. I was able to maintain a consistent grip regardless of how sweaty my hands got, which is quite impressive and something that doesn't happen on a lot of mice. But one downside of the fantastic coating here in the S1-O is that it does attract oils and dust like a magnet does metal. Now, this isn't very noticeable on the brighter S1-O colors like the white and the Mirage edition, but on the black version the coating will probably look dirty all the time, as oils and dust from your hand will stick to it constantly, similar to what happened on the OP1 8K's coating. Now, you can clean the mouse very easily by wiping it off with a microfiber cloth, but keep this in mind if you're going to get the S1-O, as if you're picky about your mouse looking clean, I'd make sure you go for the brighter shells as opposed to the darker shells. Overall, the coating here for the S1-O is fantastic. It's one of the better coatings I've tried this year, as a matter of fact. If you love the chalky coating on the Sora V2 or the PM1, you will love the coating here on the S1-O. Now, if you dislike the feeling of the S1-O's chalky coating, rest assured Santali has you covered here as well, as the mouse does come with an included set of grip tape, so let's talk about that next. As I talked about earlier in the unboxing segment of this video, the S1-O comes with a pre-cut set of white grip tape, but unlike the S1-O's fantastic coating, the grips are mediocre at best. The pre-cut grips are white and have a raised triangle-like texturing to them. The grips are quite thin, so they're easy to apply and remove, but they're made out of a harder rubber material that's naturally quite slippery. So not only can you not push into the grips to take advantage of the texturing, the material itself is very slippery. Because of this, the stock grips are one of the hardest to grip grip tapes I've used. On top of all that, the stock grips are white, so they're going to discolor over use, if you can even keep your hands on them, that is. So while I'm happy to see grips included here with the S1-O, their performance is very poor. If you need to use grip tape on the S1-O, which most people won't need to seeing as the coating is so good, I would recommend getting aftermarket grips like the XtraPad Cicada Wings or Geckos 2.0, as they'll perform significantly better than the S1-O's included grips. I'd highly recommend that Santali make some changes to their included grip tape for their future mice. A stickier, grippier tape that's a darkened color and not white would be a massive improvement and would better complement the S1-O's fantastic coating. Alright, let's talk about one of the best parts of the S1-O's next, the main clicks. Just like the Sora V2 and Sprime PM1, the S01 is using mel0n switches for its main buttons, and the click implementation here is fantastic. The shell buttons are semi-tilted but don't have any kind of indentation or finger groove in them, but since the shell buttons share the same coating as the rest of the S1-O's shell, it's very easy to anchor your fingers on the shell buttons consistently without slipping. In terms of main click audio feedback, I'll give you a quick little sound test here. As I just mentioned, the S1-O is using mel0n switches for the main clicks, which have become one of my favorite switches due to their fantastic feeling and feedback. In terms of actuation weight, the S1-O's main clicks are around average, being around a 4.5 to 5 out of 10. In terms of pre-travel, there is a tiny bit of pre-travel, just enough to keep the main clicks from being too light where you can easily misactuate them, but not too heavy where the clicks feel stiff or off. The main clicks do have a lot of post-travel, however, but the amount of post-travel will heavily depend on how you click. I have a heavy heavier clicks, so I bottom out the main clicks consistently. So to me, there's a lot of post travel on the main clicks. But if you have a lighter click, there'll be significantly less pre-travel here on the S1O's main clicks. But despite the large range of post travel on the main clicks, the shell buttons are still very well tensioned and have a fantastic rebound, which largely eliminates any oddities from the click caused by this weird variability in the post travel and makes the main clicks very snappy, responsive, and spammable. The feeling of the S1O's main clicks is also consistent across both the shell buttons. They do become slightly heavier if you click towards the top of the shell button, closer to the midline of the mouse, but not by a significant margin or in any way that's going to massively impact the click feeling here on the S1O. The shell buttons are also decently stabilized, but there is a little more side-to-side play than I expected, but thankfully the side clicks are indented into the S1O shell, so the side-to-side play on the main clicks never impacted the usage. Another benefit of the indented main clicks is that both the shell buttons are immune to any kind of finger interference that'd be caused by your thumb or pinky or ring finger resting on the side of the shell, which is fantastic to see. Overall, the main click implementation here on the S1O is very good. I'm really glad Santali used Omrons instead of Wanos for this mouse, as Omrons feel more premium and the click feeling is fantastic. I would like to see less post travel on a future version of the S1O, but this is a pretty minimal complaint, and overall the S1O's main clicks are extremely well executed. The S1O's side buttons, on the other hand, just like the main clicks, are also fantastically implemented. The side buttons are the same slightly curved pill-like design we've seen on a couple other mice this year. The side buttons also have the same coating as the rest of the S1O shell, so they're very grippy and easy to consistently actuate. Another thing that makes the side buttons easy to actuate is that they're positioned quite forward in the S1O shell. Both the side buttons are very easy to reach, even for people like myself who have very large hands. The S1O side buttons are slightly pronounced from the mouse's shell. Personally speaking, I would like to see the side buttons a little bit more pronounced, but they're pronounced enough that they're still easy to reliably actuate. In terms of side button audio feedback, I'll give you a quick little sound test here. Inside, the S1O is using the Wano white dot switches, the standard switch we've seen for most side buttons on most mice this year. In terms of actuation weight, the side buttons feel slightly heavier than the main clicks, feeling more around a 6 out of 10. Definitely a little on the heavy side for a side button, but still usable from my testing. In terms of pre-travel, there's pretty much no pre-travel, but just like the main clicks, there is a decent amount of post-travel, specifically if you press the side buttons deeply into the shell. And since the side button's actuation force is heavier than the main clicks, you'll notice this post-travel a lot more on the side clicks than you will on the main clicks. But the feeling of the side buttons actuation force and pre and post travel is consistent on both the side buttons, and both the side buttons are very well tensioned, so they have a snappy rebound that helps to mitigate the longer pre-travel and keeps the side buttons fairly spammable. The side buttons are also very well stabilized, they don't have any wobble or play to them. Overall, the S1O's side buttons are pretty good. I would like to see the side buttons themselves be a little more pronounced from the shell, and the actuation weight slightly reduced to be similar to the actuation weight of the main clicks, but I'm very much splitting hairs here. Overall, the side click implementation here on the S1O is quite solid. Next up, let's talk about the S1O's scroll wheel. The scroll wheel's texturing is a linear rubber texturing that runs across the entire wheel. The texturing is quite shallow though, it's not as pronounced as the texturing on a lot of other scroll wheels, but despite this, the scroll wheel is still easy to grip, which is great to see. Inside, the S1O is using a TTC 11mm encoder, a more defined encoder that gives the S1O a scroll force of around 5.5 out of 10. The encoder also gives the scroll wheel fairly defined scroll points, so the scroll wheel is easy to control when scrolling. In terms of the scroll wheel click, the S1O is using a Wano red dot switch. The switch is a raised level 2 design. The switch's actuation weight is similar to the side buttons, being around a 6 out of 10, which is pretty usual for a scroll wheel click. Thankfully though, since the scroll wheel has such defined scroll points from the 11mm encoder, you can easily scroll wheel click without misactuating the scroll wheel, which is great to see. Overall, the S1O scroll wheel is solidly implemented. Personally speaking, I didn't mind the slightly higher actuation weight for the main click, as it's lighter than most scroll wheels out there. Maybe Santali could slightly lower the actuation force further on a future version of the S1O, but the current implementation is still very good in my opinion. Alright, let's talk sensor and MCU next. Like most of the mice we've seen released in 2024, the S1O is using the bread and butter combo of the Pixar 3395 DMT6QU and the Nordic 52840 MCU. As we've seen countless times, this bread and butter combo has essentially been perfected, and the performance of the sensor and MCU combo was flawless here in the S1O from my testing, with no issues of any kind. The 3395 sensor is centrally positioned in the S1O shell, right at the midline of the mouse. It is an unlock 3395 with a max DPI of 26,000. The sensor also has ripple, angle snapping, and motion sync available on the sensor, and these can be enabled or disabled via the software. Keeping in theme with the Sprime PM1 and the Sora V2, the 3395 here on the S1 also has performance mode options, so you can enable a high power and low power mode via the software, but this can only be used when running the S1 on 1K Hz, just like we saw in the PM1 and Sora V2. In terms of polling rate ranges, as I mentioned earlier, the S1 has up to 8K polling on both the wired and wireless connectivity modes, and the implementations of the high polling rates is solid. I was able to test the 1, 2, and 4K polling rates on both connectivity types, and I didn't run into any issues aside from the issues with the cable. I sadly couldn't test the 8K polling as the mouse's 8K polling absolutely destroyed my PC, but the 2 and 4K polling rates were perfectly implemented and performed fantastically over my testing. Overall though, the sensor and MCU combo here on the S1 are perfectly executed as expected for a 3395X 52840 combo. While the 3395's implementation was perfect, I would love to see a 3950 on a future version of Santali's mouse, but we'll have to wait and see what they cook up. Another area where Santali has done a fantastic job here with the S1 is the stock skates. As I mentioned earlier, the mouse comes with a pre-installed full-size stock skate and an extra set, which is great to see. The skates are 100% PTFE, and the shapes are the standard larger surface area top skate and 2 smaller surface area chip-like skates at the base. Now, for those of you who've been watching the channel for a long time, you'll know I generally don't like stock skates due to their unbalanced surface area, but the ones here in the S1 are actually quite good, and the surface difference between the top and the bottom skates is pretty close to being balanced. They're easily the most balanced stock skates I've personally used, but while the stock skates here in the S1 are quite solid, I did end up removing them to install my XRPad Obsidian Air Donuts as they're my preferred skate type. The process of removing the S1 stock skates was kind of tricky though, as there are no skate removal ramps on the bottom of the mouse. Now, keeping in line with the similarities between the Sora V2 and the Sprime PM1, who also didn't have skate removal ramps on the bottom of their mice, this was kind of expected, but I would like to see them added onto Santali's next mice, as that would make removing the stock skates a little bit easier. And speaking of Santali's future mice, they did confirm that since all their future mice will not have this USB-A dongle storage compartment, we will have a proper full-size top and bottom set skate, not the tri-skate design we currently have. Unfortunately, we don't know what those skates are going to look like, and we don't know if they're going to be balanced in their surface area, so we'll have to wait and see, but regardless, hopefully we'll see some skate removal ramps on their future versions. But overall, the S1 stock skates are actually quite good, easily the best set of stock skates I've used in a while, and while I remove them, 99% of people will be very happy with the stock skates here on the S1. Keeping in theme with the similarities between the S1 and the Sora V2 and PM1, the S1 is using the same 250 mAh batteries those mice were using. Now, according to Santali, the S1 is rated for approximately 80 hours of constant use. The site didn't specify what report rate this was measured at, but I'm going to assume it was on 1K Hertz. Now, to quickly clarify, the battery estimations I'm going to give you here for the S1 are measured off of constant movement, where the mouse was charged to 100% and on each of the polling rates it was slapped on a mouse jiggler and it was taken off when the mouse died. So the battery life is not going to be what Santali is advertising, as they're advertising a general use situation where the mouse is used and also left to rest for a good amount of time. I measured mine on constant movement, so while my battery levels are much lower than what Santali is advertising, it's not because they're advertising the wrong thing. I'm just advertising constant movement while they're advertising intermittent movement. So with the S1 set to 1K Hertz, it lasted around 47 hours of, again, constant movement. On 2K polling, it was around 38 hours. On 4K polling, it was 14 hours. And on 8K polling, it was 9 hours. Alright, and lastly, let's talk about repairability. As I mentioned earlier, the internal design of the S1 has significantly improved from what we saw in the Sora V2 and PM1, and overall, the S1 is a very repairable mouse. To open the unit, all you need to do is remove the stock skates and remove 4 screws from the base, and then you can take a fingernail or a pry bar and separate the top and the bottom base shells. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the S1 doesn't have that clip towards the back of the shell the Sora V2 and the PM1 had, so disconnecting the top and bottom shell here in the S1 is significantly easier than it was on those mice. Now, after disconnecting the 2 shells, there is a very thin ribbon cable that runs to the side buttons, but thankfully the cable is easy to work around, unlike the Lemoki G2's cable, so the risk of you damaging this cable is pretty low. Now, unfortunately, all the switches, encoders, and sensors are soldered to the main board, so if you want to replace anything, you will need to desolder them, but on the plus side, it's very easy to replace or mod out the battery, which I'm very happy to see. The dongle storage compartment does make installing a bigger battery a little difficult due to some size constraints, but I'm happy to see the S1's battery be very easy to replace or upgrade if needed. But overall, the S1 is a very serviceable mouse, much more so than the other polycarbonate mice I've tested this year. As always, with every mice I cover here on the channel, I will have a full in-depth teardown of the S1 coming out in a couple days, so if you want a little bit more of how to mod or replace replace the battery in the S1-O or see how it's built on the inside, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the S1-O's teardown. Well, overall, the Santali S1-O has really quite impressed me. When I first reached out to Santali, I thought the S1-O was just going to be another ABS plastic sim mouse. I had no idea the mouse had so many similarities to the PM1 and the Sora V2, and this was all a welcome surprise that made the S1-O even better than I expected. But while I love the S1-O, it's not perfect. The stock grips are very bad. The USB-C port being the same non-universal design that we saw on the PM1 and the Sora V2 is quite disappointing, and combined with the horrible stock cable makes utilizing the 8K wired polling here on the S01 very difficult. I would also like to see the side buttons slightly more pronounced, but this is a much more minimal issue compared to the USB-C port and the cable. But thankfully, all the big glaring issues with the S1-O are issues that can be very easily fixed on a future version, and combined with the fixes that Santali is already going to be implementing on their next versions, I'm very excited to see what the next iteration of the S1-O is, as with a couple minor changes this mouse can be perfect. Now, in regards to the current version of the S1-O, despite the mouse's flaws, I still do think this mouse is a really good buy, specifically if you love the Sora V2 but want a larger shape, as the S1-O is that exactly with the same material, a better coating, and it also has 8K polling, which somehow the Sora V2 still does not have. On the topic of the Sora V2, I would love to see Santali make a mini S1-O with all the fixes I mentioned earlier to compete with the Sora V2, as a mini S1-O would be an insane mouse, of course, because it would have 8K polling, so it would kind of beat out the Sora V2 in that way. But we'll have to wait and see what Santali is cooking up next. I will definitely be keeping a very close eye on Santali in the future, and I'll be sure to cover any of their upcoming products. But if you'd like to learn more about the Santali S1-O, I will have the product pages linked down in the video description for you all. But that's going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much again to Santali for sending over the Aagaz S1-O Mirage for review. I greatly appreciate it. Big thank you to our channel members Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, Lunars, and Mark World. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to become a member here and support what I'm doing here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and the teardown project, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 a month. That is the best way to directly support the channel, so thank you very much in advance for your support. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Letho Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, Met Keys, TJ Exclusives, and a couple other retailers to save yourself some money on your orders and help support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the Santali Aagaz S1-O Mirage, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.